One marvels as one looks at the early generation and the number of saints that are commanded to do what seems the impossible. That happened in Kirtland, Ohio, when a commandment comes, unequivocal, that they must build a house. And they didn't at first understand what that might require. Joseph postponed asking the saints for this sacrifice. And then comes thunder from heaven. And then comes a revelation that they have sinned in postponing, and that if they keep the commandments of God, they will have power to build a house, and if they don't, the love of the Father will not continue with them, and they will walk in darkness. They respond, and thus begins the saga of building this house of glory. Joseph stands one day with Joseph Young and Brigham Young and says to them, "We don't have anyone in the church who can build. What do you suggest?" And Brigham says, "I know a man in Canada who is a great construction man, but he's not a member of the church, and I don't know if he would do this." And Joseph says, "Brigham, I give you a mission." He requires him to go, tells him he is to convert Artemus Millet, have him come to Kirtland bringing his family, and with him at least $1,000. That's an assignment. And instead of Brigham saying, "You really are in rare form today, Joseph," he says, "All right, I'll go." He brought Artemus Millet, and they began the project. The first man to break ground, according to Mother Smith, was Hiram. He was eager to be the man to start the groundbreaking. What did they understand they were doing? Basically, the church at large understood the list given by the Lord in section 88. 6 characterizations of what the temple would be: a house of prayer, a house of fasting, a house of faith, a house of learning, a house of glory, a house of God. In the prophet's mind, each of those words had a special meaning because of his experience thus far in the church. Prayer, the prophet learned, was more powerful when it was united. He was taught that if they would learn to pray always, which is impossible in words, but not impossible if it's in the heart. Pray always, and I will pour out my Spirit upon you. He had already apparently learned by revelation that there can be patterns of prayer that bring quorums or groups of sisters together. And when they are united, when they are agreed as touching all things that they pray, somehow this has greater power with the heavens. He taught in the temple that first should come secret prayer, prayer from the heart, verbalized, if so, in whispers. Then should come what he called sealing prayer, where one person, the presiding elder or the leader, in effect voices his own conviction about those present. Then there should be a spirit that we now express with what is called the Hosanna shout, which means that you pour out in the phrase Hosanna, Hosanna, Ho-Shana. Ultimately in Hebrew that means, "Oh come," or it means welcome, or it means, "Oh save us." secret prayer, sealing prayer, Hosanna prayer. And that's what they practiced as he taught them in the Kirtland Temple. House of fasting meant to him what it had been told him, that fasting is feasting on the Spirit of the Lord. The Scripture defines fasting as rejoicing in the Lord. So he's thinking not just of the absence of food, but of the focus of the soul, which leads to rejoicing. This temple was to be a house of rejoicing. A house of faith. Joseph is told in the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants that the whole purpose of the restoration is that faith might increase in the earth. And that meant faith in the living God, which would lead to the establishment of the church. And he once said, out of experience, no one ever really had faith without having something along with it. Faith, if it is genuine, brings change or results. And he had found that out as a boy in a grove. And he wanted the saints to understand that their faith could increase. He even said once, faith comes by hearing the word of God from the servants of God, and that is always attended by the spirit of prophecy and revelation. He once said he didn't require anyone to find evidences that he was a prophet. What the Lord wanted was for those who had faith to understand that once the word of the Lord was declared, it would have an influence over their minds, and he added, over the logical mind, without other testimony. The temple was to be a house of faith, where that could be concentrated in a whole congregation. Then he speaks of faith leading to a house of learning. And when this temple was built, the top floor was 5 separate classrooms. And those classrooms became teaching mechanisms for all of the members of the church, from the young who were a bit illiterate and hardly knew how to read, to the mature and apostolic witnesses who learned, among other things, Hebrew. A house of learning included for Joseph Smith the recognition that not all have faith, but if they combine the learning experience of faith with the learning experience out of the best books, then they will increase in every way. So he calls the schools together, he appoints the best possible teachers, and he himself undertakes the study of Hebrew. And the man that they brought from New York had written a book on Hebrew and then wrote a special supplement to that, designed for beginning students. He actually had excerpts from the Bible, the Masoretic text, with the vowel pointings. And this is a great, difficult language to learn. The prophet's own journal says that he rejoiced in being able to read the great books in the original. And he himself was one of the best students in that program. So from house of learning to the phrase house of glory. Glory is a synonym for intelligence, but it also is light and fire and power. And the prayer that was finally offered, which he claimed he received by revelation, so by a strange coincidence, one asks God to know what to ask God. That disturbs some of the saints. You have to pray in the Spirit. If you pray in the Spirit directs what you will pray. And in that prayer, he asks that it will be fulfilled on this house as it was on the day of Pentecost. And what happened on the day of Pentecost? Cloven tongues of fire. And even little children in this neighborhood during the day ran saying to their parents or others, the building is on fire. Inside, the prophet's father, in one of the fast meetings they held, who had heard that prayer but forgotten it, suddenly is startled as the room fills as with consuming fire and actually cries out, "What?" is the house on fire? And the prophet and others say, relax, relax. This is the fulfillment of our prayer. So we have a house of glory, light, and truth. And then finally, he talks over and over, not just in section 88, of how it is a house of God, and the saints at first, I suppose, couldn't understand what's different than a meeting house, a chapel, or other buildings that have been used in the past. What's different in a temple? And he tried to communicate that the Lord had made known to him that God had promised to unveil his face in the temple. God had promised that his name would be put in the temple. My name shall be here. He had promised that he would manifest himself to his servants in mercy in this house, and that this was the beginning of the blessing that would be poured out upon the church and eventually the whole world. The day of dedication came. One can ask, how much did it really cost? And if you use the measuring rod of the widow's mite, which is, how much do you have proportional to what you give? One estimate says that this building cost more than any religious building in American history. It was an unprecedented sacrifice. Now comes 27 March, 1836. And we understand that at least 900 and perhaps 1,000 gathered on the lower floor of the temple. They opened the windows and people clustered around the windows so they could hear. In some cases, it was permitted that children come and sit on the laps of their parents. And they began the dedicatory services. One of the most remarkable parts of that is that Sidney Rigdon was a speaker, and the total time of the dedication, somewhere between 6 and 7 hours. He spoke for 2 hours. 2 hours. Sidney Rigdon's oration was so impressive that some said no superlative could do justice to it. And what he had said mainly was, quoting the New Testament, Jesus once said, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man hath not a place to lay his head." Now, he said, in effect, I bear witness, he has a place. He has a place he may come, as he came anciently to the tabernacle to have communion with Moses. Only now, he has promised he will come to bless all of his saints. There were songs, one of them, the remarkable W.W. Phelps, Spirit of God, like a fire is burning. There was a choir, and the choir was in each of the 4 corners, so that, in effect, all of the sound combined in the center of the temple. And the temple choir, not only sang, but some of them, among them Prescindia Huntington, say that they also heard heavenly choirs. The prophet Joseph spoke and testified of what he knew about the ultimate meaning of life and of the temple, and then again other songs, and finally he announces he will read, not give, but read the dedicatory prayer. Now section 109 of the Doctrine and Covenants. It's a long prayer. It was given him, he said, by revelation. And the first part's essentially ask for the Lord to accept the sacrifice, because the prophet makes it very clear that humble, simple, even poverty-stricken people who only were living on hominy and milk had built this temple. He also called attention to the Lord that they had done so with tremendous opposition, using an old phrase that it was as if they had a trowel in one hand and a musket in the other to protect from those who were trying to interfere. There were a time or two when the people said they were going to set fire to the temple. They didn't succeed. There were times when people actually stayed in the temple day and night, sleeping on their guns aware of possibilities of attack. They had sacrificed. There is a story that the women, who we know for sure helped in other ways, including the preparation of the veils, which were hung from the ceiling, took their glassware and crushed it in order to make the exterior sparkle in the sun. And that was apparently the idea of the builder, Artemis Millet. I should mention that Truman O. Angell was another of the planners of the temple, and that when the question is asked, well, what did he go on? How did he know what to build? What size, what shape? Two things. One, the revelation had specified the exact measurements of the base, and also that there would be a higher and a lower court. But according to Truman O. Angell, the prophet and two of his closest associates prayed, and they were given a vision of what the temple would in fact look like in its completion. So he, the prophet, may not have been called an architect, but he certainly was involved in planning and executing it. And then he asked that the families and the connections of the families who had been faithful would receive an outpouring of the Spirit, and that their prayers could be heard and mingled with the prayers of heavenly hosts. For the prophet just clearly presupposed that this was a link to the heavens, and that whatever rejoicing was occurring on earth was being matched and even intensified by heavenly hosts who were near. For Joseph Smith, the spirit world was not distant or remote. For him, it was here, and only a veil over our eyes prevents our recognition of it. Not only that, he said those, especially our loved ones who know us, are, quote, not far from us, and they know our thoughts, motions, and feelings. One version of that is our thoughts, emotions, and feelings, and are sometimes pained therewith. But the implication is also sometimes rejoiced therewith. The Phelps hymn cries out, "Angels are coming to visit the earth." And the saints in this dedication felt that, and even children did. An incident that Eliza R. Snow records tells the whole story. Here is a mother who comes to the temple to enter with a 2-month-old child. And somebody stops and says, no, we can't do that. She had made severe sacrifices for the temple, and she pleads, I need to be here. She goes to the prophet's father, and he says, sister, go. I will encourage you to go, and all will be well. She's in the session of the dedication, and after the prophet's prayer, they do the Hosanna shout. Children have an instinctive fear of loud noises, and the mother is anxious. She stands up with the baby. They start the Hosanna shout. The child pushes the coverlet aside and joins in the Hosanna shout. Eliza says, you may not believe that, but it happened. So from children to the aged. And Joseph once said, I love the testimony of my aged friends. This was an outpouring. A child is looking out the window during the day and says, Mommy, look. And she points to the roof of the temple, and she says, there are men on the roof. Well, they were white-clad angels. And later on, someone who had been in the meeting that day emerged, and the word got back, yes, Joseph told us that there were angels in and on the temple. The dedicatory prayer speaks of sacrifice. The dedicatory prayer reinstates or reviews the promises. And then in the closing part, Joseph pleads, let our voices mingle with the bright, shining seraphs in heaven. Well, then they did the Hosanna shout. And the last phrase is to God and the Lamb. Why didn't they say God the Father and Jesus or the Messiah? Because I suggest Christ, as Joseph had been taught, is the beginning and the end. And if that has no other meaning, it means he is the beginning and the end of temple worship. If you begin with him, the culmination of the temple experience will be that you're closer to him. And the lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. It is not just a person, but a person who condescended to give himself and to give his soul in changing the lives of all who would come to him. So they shouted. It wasn't just a murmur. It wasn't just an attempt to raise your voice, but as later prophets taught, and one of them being Lorenzo Snow, who was here this day, the Hosanna shout should come from our depths, because he said someday you will not just be practicing this in gratitude. Someday you will use the Hosanna shout to actually welcome Christ as he descends, and you will shout with your whole being. Well, so they did. And Eliza Arsenault says it was as if they could raise the roof. The prophet then, in effect, says, now all this has been done. Anyone present who feels to do so should stand and let the spiritual gifts be manifest. And so, for example, Brigham stands, speaks in inspired words, perhaps in tongues. Over in one section, a brother stands, and simultaneously Prescindia Huntington stands, and in perfect harmony sing a song. And then someone else rises and interprets what the song was. Any gift that you can find that was poured out in the book of Acts, and more too, sooner or later, were experienced by the saints. And when they go back home, they carry something of the Spirit with them, and they have what Joseph calls a jubilee. So, for example, men go house to house, and they administer the sacrament in houses, and then they say, I feel like you should receive a blessing, and they bless. And then someone else says, well, then you should receive a blessing, and they bless. And this goes on for many days, and it is so intense that the prophet actually had to stand up in a meeting and say, brothers and sisters, this is wonderful, but you need to understand that the opposite will come. And some of the saints said to him, well, the millennium has come, so we're not going to have any more temptation. We're not going to have any more trial. And the prophet had to say, oh, yes, we are. After great blessings will come trial. And so it was. One of the amazements of the Kirtland Temple experience is that several times the saints stayed in the temple all night long by candlelight. That would have taken a lot of candles. And that was an assignment from Joseph to them. He went home that first day afterward and told them to remain. And by the way, they had a second session, if you will, another dedication the next day, so that those who couldn't get in the first time could the second. 1 week later, they had another service here. So the temple was not just dedicated on one day. On April 6th, which is a special day, There was a very elaborate sermon and session in the temple, including the passing of the sacrament. The sacrament became a central role. There's a swing-up table just below the three major altars, and that's where they attended the sacrament, and Joseph often himself became the deacon with others in passing the sacrament, and others administered it. All night long, and no one slept, and no one wanted to go home. And Wilford Woodruff and Oliver Cowdery both kept journals of those experiences, almost minute by minute. And they include the details of how they sometimes broke into groups and quorums, lowering the curtains so that you're in a set of pews and others separated. And that becomes the introduction to the prophet's prayer, that they get divine assurance that the temple has been accepted. Here is what happened according to the narrative. In the upper pulpit, apparently with the curtains down, 3 different pulpits, and then with the entire temple filled with people who are praying, but not praying in loud words. Joseph and Oliver kneel, and they ask, in effect, "O Lord, is this temple acceptable unto you?" Having so prayed, they stand, and it's while they're standing, facing the pulpit, that, as they put it, the veil was taken from our minds. We saw the Lord standing upon the breastwork of the pulpit before us. And under his feet was a paved work of pure gold. And then the exact description. His eyes were as a flame of fire. His face shone above the brightness of the sun. His hair white like the pure snow. And his voice was as the voice of the rushing of great waters, even the voice of Jehovah, saying. And now Christ absolutely clarifies his identity. I am the first and the last. I am he who liveth. I am he who was slain. And then, I am your advocate with the Father. And then I think the sentences that meant the most to Joseph to this point in his life. Behold, your sins are forgiven you. You are clean before me. Therefore, lift up your heads and rejoice. And so they did. And then he promised that this temple would be what it was to be, that he had accepted it, that his name would be here, and that he would manifest himself in mercy to his servants. When the prophet went home, after that experience, he had a hard time going to sleep, even though he was worried. And his journal says that through the night, it was as if he was saying Hosanna silently through his whole being. First, I assume because of this culmination that some said could never happen. The temple was not only finished, it was dedicated and accepted. Second, because, as had been prophesied, the saints themselves had been endowed and lifted and edified. And third, because he had received another witness from on high that his own life was acceptable to the Lord. It is one thing to be loved of the Lord. It is another to have him say, you are acceptable to me. That is to say, worthy. And it is even still more to say, I have fulfilled my promises to you. And so he didn't sleep well, but he rejoiced well all night long. I've often wondered about the sisters who had sacrificed so much. And if we call the roll of those who had actually served in this project simultaneously with the Zion's camp, the place was depleted of strong laborers for a period because of Zion's camp. And there were sisters who went along on Zion's camp as well as who remained here and kept the fires burning. If you call the roll of those sisters and then try to track what happened to them and their families through our history, they became what President Clark used to call the anchor families of the church. And though there was purging and purifying of the church and people fell away, they remained faithful and strong, and were capable then of, as if this weren't enough, and it wasn't, having been driven here, from here, they then are commanded again and again and again to sacrifice, to build temples. It's been said that Joseph told the 12 that God would feel after them and wrench their very heartstrings, and that they would have to prove that they could stand. Well, after this glorious outpouring, maybe a greater one that had ever occurred in the world since the day of Pentecost, suddenly begin defections. Joseph had encouraged the people to come here. Property values had increased. The economy was flourishing, and so he says to them, we will start a bank, we will have our own specie, and we will exchange, and we will build. Well, that was called the Kirtland Safety Society, and it turned out it was not safe. It turned out that the national picture of banks was decline and often just giving up. We tried to issue currency, and it was passed around among the people of our faith, but shortly skepticism grew as to what would eventually happen, and people refused to accept even a $1 bill if it was on the Kirtland Bank. And then it got so serious that a law was passed that if you try to pass this currency, that's like counterfeiting, and you can be fined. One story says $1,000 for passing a $1 bill. That's how serious the crisis was. And instead of the people rallying around Joseph and acknowledging that it wasn't his fault that there's a national bankruptcy plague, they began to defect. It's like a later prophet said, the most sensitive part of a man is his pocketbook. And they, out of covetousness and out of normal concern for their property values, totally blamed Joseph. 6 of the original 12 simply blew away from their loyalties and left saying, you are a false prophet. Others of the saints, we haven't any firm estimates, maybe a third of the people living in this area, turned their backs against Joseph and against the church because of the failure of the bank. There have been regional studies, including the Kirtland period, which deal with the question, were the books properly kept in the Kirtland Safety Society and what went wrong? And for a time, the books had been lost, and that was suspicious. Somebody may have shredded them or tried to hide them. They were later discovered In Chicago, they have been scrupulously studied and they were accurately kept. There was no double dealing here. But if one asks the question, how come such a height could be reached by the church and then this terrible descent which affected everybody? The answer in part is, Joseph said, the closer we come to living celestial laws, the greater the opposition to be expected. And he once said to Heber C. Kimball, who returned from his mission to Britain and reported the terrible buffetings they had had as they tried to introduce the gospel, Heber, when I heard that you had had these experiences, I rejoiced because I knew the adversary was trying to prevent what would be a glorious success. And the glorious success came. So at every stage in the unfolding history of the church, one can see the evidence of darkness being a conspiracy against the forward steps. And if there is an ultimate target, someone has said that the adversary goes after the crown jewels. Well, if there's an ultimate target of the adversary, it is temples. And this was the beginning, as prophesied, of an ever-expanding and world-influencing building of temples. And the opposition could have brought the church down, except for a faithful core. And the prophet once said, I have reason to believe the church is being purged. And so it was at Kirtland, and so it was in the successive stages. The time came when people were walking around and shouting in enmity of the church. And one of those nights, Brigham Young hears somebody and goes out with a cowhide and says, we don't need any more braying in this town. I suggest you leave. Well, he was stalwart, and he continually sustained the prophet. So did Heber C. Kimball, but others had their problems. Time finally came when Joseph had to leave, literally had to leave to save his life because of threats. What happened to the temple? Well, those who were enemies of the prophet, instead of having meetings of edifying and self-instruction, began holding meetings of rebellion. And John Boynton, in a symbolic act of hate, finally herded pigs into the temple as if it were a stable or a pigsty. So Joseph, concealed, leaves Kirtland, and his family soon follows. And thus begins his more full-time involvement in the church in Missouri.